Really great to see everyone again, and welcome back to our Power Up series. It's been a little while since we last met in November, so we are especially glad you could join us today. And as you know, this series is all about sustainability, keeping our residency programs strong and resilient to be able to move forward well beyond grant funding. In our first two sessions, we focused on sustainability planning and how tools like the LCAP can support long-term funding and support program alignment. Today, we're shifting our focus to strategic staffing models that districts are using to sustain the residency programs over time. You'll get to hear from three different programs. We'll share more details on that in a bit. But once again, thanks again for being here. We're looking forward to continuing the conversation together. Of course, this Power Up series is a collaboration between SRTAC, the statewide Residency Technical Assistance Center, and TRL, the Residency Lab. Our goal is to share real examples, get your ideas going, and give you time to reflect on what might be possible in your own program. We'll take a quick minute to reintroduce ourselves. My name is Javier Vaca, and I'm the Southern Region Hub Lead for SRTAC, and I'll send it over to Amy.
Hi everyone, Amy Bennett. I work out of the Santa Clara County Office of Education as a coordinator for SRTAC, and I will turn it over to Heather.
Hi, and good morning. Dr. Heather Michelle here. I'm the director of the Residency Lab. Excited to be in space with all of you and continue our conversation on residency sustainability. And I will pass it back to Javier.
Actually, I think I'll come off.
Oh, go ahead, Amy.
So as we move into our third Power Up of the year, I just want to take a moment. You've seen this slide before, but to zoom out and kind of revisit the overarching themes across all four sessions and how they connect. So if you remember back in October, we really grounded our work in the sustainability framework, kind of establishing a shared understanding of what sustainability means within educator residency programs. We built some kind of foundational knowledge around LCAP essentials and learned from an expert on how local goals and funding priorities and accountability structures can intersect. And then in November, we kind of continued with that theme by taking a deeper dive into LCAP implementation, and we highlighted program spotlights from across the state, showcasing how those LEAs were aligning their residency programs to local priorities and funding streams in really strategic ways. And today, as Javier mentioned, our focus is going to be on leveraging paid LEA roles as a strategy for sustainability. We'll explore staffing models that support both residents and districts with a particular emphasis on LEA-funded roles such as paraeducator and substitute teacher positions. You'll get to hear from field experts who have implemented these models, and we'll share some lessons learned, maybe some challenges encountered, and practical considerations for you if your program is considering such a staffing model. And then our final session of the year, we'll look ahead to creative and emerging funding approaches that are being used across the field and really collaborate to surface practical strategies that you can adapt to strengthen long-term sustainability of your own programs. Please note, though, we have had a date change for this final session. It will no longer be held on February 20th, which was that original date we had promoted. The new date is Monday, March 16th. You should have received an email from Zoom with an updated calendar invite that notified you of that change, but we just wanted to make sure that everyone was aware of that. And as I shared during our first convening of the year, the design of this Power Up series was directly informed by data, looking at survey responses, coaching conversations, and patterns that we were seeing across residency programs. And I really want to make those connections visible now before we move into what we've planned for today. So last spring, our partners at West Ed administered the Teacher Residency Grant Program Survey, or TRGP survey, you'll hear it referenced as, and that reached 105 LEAs and achieved a 79% response rate, providing insights into the current state of residency programs across California. And several questions on that survey focused specifically on sustainability. One key area the survey explored was whether programs are leveraging or planning for or considering paid LEA roles as a sustainability strategy. And what we saw in the data was really clear from the field that many programs are actively exploring or already implementing paid staffing models for their residents. For LEA paid paraprofessional roles, which is the top band on the slide, over half of programs are either already implementing, planning to implement, or exploring that particular staffing approach. When it came to LEA paid substitute roles, which is the bottom graph, the trend is even stronger, with a significant portion of programs already using, planning to implement, or exploring this model. And so, taken together, this tells us that paid LEA roles are a central area of interest and experimentation for programs across the state. And so, our team felt it was really critical to dedicate an entire session to this topic. And so, today's focus is directly responsive to what programs told us they're grappling with. How do we go about designing something like that? What does the funding look like? How could we implement paid LEA roles in ways that support our residents, while also meeting our district needs and strengthening long-term program sustainability? And so, building on that data we just reviewed, today's session kind of shifts us from trends in the field to real examples of how residency programs are designing and implementing those paid staffing models in practice. And so, by the end of today's session, participants will hopefully understand how strategic staffing models can support program sustainability, learn from other residency programs' experiences, including lessons learned and implementation insights, and then identify opportunities and key considerations for applying those models within your own local context. And throughout the session, we'll keep things interactive and reflective. We have dedicated time for discussion, collaboration, and shared learning. And this is a quick look at how we'll spend our time together over the next 2 hours. We'll start with some welcome and connection. And then next, we'll hear from our partners at the Learning Policy Institute, LPI. They're going to share a recent publication they authored on this topic and some examples around sustainable staffing models that could potentially inform your planning. We'll take a short break for 5 minutes at around the top of the hour. And then after that, we'll be hearing directly from 3 different residency programs that are implementing paid LEA roles. This will be a great chance to kind of see what's working in practice and what lessons others have learned. And then we'll move into some reflection time using our program planning tools to really think about how today's ideas connect to your own program and identify some strategies you might want to adapt. And then we'll wrap up with some reminders. So that's the roadmap for our time together. Plenty of opportunities to learn from content, from our peers, and from your own reflections. And then, as always, just a quick reminder, we have created a 1-page resource document. We'll share that in the chat. This is a living document. We update and revisit it with each session. Inside it, you'll find links to the slide decks, core resources like the characteristics of effective residency programs, your program planning folders, etc., as well as session-specific materials. So any of the resources that we're referencing throughout today will be next to session 3's content. And if you missed any of our previous sessions, you can access all of the past resources from this document as well. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Heather.
Thank you, Amy. I appreciate that. So we are going to begin our work together today by really grounding ourselves in 2 different frameworks that SR Tech and the Residency Lab use on a regular basis. The first one is the characteristics of effective teacher residency programs, and the second one is our sustainability framework. I'm going to unpack the characteristics. If you have been attending programming with TRL and SR Tech for some time, you are familiar with these. Although I do think it is important to revisit and kind of unpack them each time we meet. So the characteristics of effective teacher residency programs serve as a common framework for all residency programs at various levels of implementation. They exemplify the scope and complexity of residency work. They center equity and justice They also center data and data-driven implementation. They form the basis of all support and assistance for residency programs. Whenever TRL and SRTAC get together in space, we draw on the characteristics to inform the offerings that we provide the field, and to really make sure that we also are using the characteristics as a sounding board moving forward with residency implementation. And then finally, they appear as an appendix in all CTC requests for application. Today, we're going to be really focusing on financial sustainability. That is characteristic number 3, and that's kind of the through line and the standard that we're going to be looking at, characteristic we're going to be looking at. As a reminder, we have first, we have program folders for each residency program. Those are linked in the resource document that Amy referenced earlier. We will be digging into those a little bit deeper later on in the presentation, but I can tell you now that each program folder has the modules 1 and 2 workbooks in them. And within those module workbooks are slides the slide decks that support the module work. There is a running notes page that we really encourage our residency programs to use, and then also the planning tool. And, just a reminder that as we are engaging in looking at long-term sustainability for residency programs, having common documents that can be referenced and referred to by all parties, including SRTAC, the lab, the IHE, and the LEA, really support that idea of institutional sustainability, right? Having one place where you're documenting the work that you are moving through. And so we will be referencing those later on. The second framework that we want to kind of ground our work in today is the residency sustainability framework. And this is something that the residency lab came up with about 2 years ago when we really began to engage in this work. The residency sustainability framework has 3 different pillars, and we're going to spend just a little bit of time unpacking each one, kind of to provide a backdrop for the work that we're going to be engaging in today. And the first pillar is institutional sustainability. So institutional sustainability really is about getting those elements of residency work that you probably already have or have thought about in some degree, especially if you've been interacting with the residency lab or SRTAC for any time, right? So those are things like a common mission statement, aspirational objectives, an actionable strategic plan, well-defined roles, and staffing. Sustainable residency programs focus more on process than product, but they do have those kind of critical institutional characteristics that glue and kind of keep the work going and moving forward. And that's one way to think about institutional sustainability. So making sure you have those pieces in place. The second pillar is financial sustainability. And this is the one that is on the top of everyone's mind right now. And although it is important, it is equally as important as institutional. And what I'm about to talk about, engagement, financial sustainability is one of the pillars. And this is the idea that residency programs can be self-reliant. Okay. And there's a difference between self-reliance and self-sufficient. Self-sufficient is you have your program funded, you know where the funding is. Perhaps this is a recurring funding stream. You don't really have to be concerned with it because you can consistently depend on it on a regular basis. That's self-sufficient, right? What we're really encouraging people to move into is this idea of self-reliant, right? And self-reliant means the residency program can draw on funding streams that are found outside the residency space and the residency program, and also inside. So you're looking at braiding funds, you're looking at drawing on different residency funding streams. And so you're self-reliant in the sense that you know where those are coming from. You are confident that you can find ways to fund your program. You have the resources and kind of the strategy put in place to make that happen. One thing that we are encouraging our residency programs to really consider as we are moving towards a more self-reliant kind of perspective is to really think about the actual cost of the model that you would like to, that your specific context supports, right? The actual cost that that is specific to your specific residency program, and think about those things that you could let slide and maybe aren't the most important part of your residency program, and also those things that are non-negotiable. So really getting down to that bottom line in terms of how much money do you really need to run the program that suits your context the best. And then the last pillar is engagement sustainability. And this is one, again, that's equally as important. The sustainable residency program includes engaged and committed partners at all institutional levels. So critical partners include your department chair, your clinical practice coordinator, your collective bargaining unit, human resource departments, residency supervisors and mentors, all of this different leadership. You want to find different ways to engage them into work so that they have concrete examples of what residency looks like, the effectiveness of residency, so that they have real life examples to draw on when they are ultimately making decisions about whether to fund your program, about whether to keep it running. So really thinking about casting a wide web of how to keep your leadership engaged in multiple partners involved in the work. And so we wanted to just spend some time on thinking about that framework and also looking to where you might see different elements of that framework as the presenters unpack today, because they're all bringing that different perspectives of different parts of the sustainability framework. And so kind of bringing that lens into the conversations of what you see today in the presentations. And I think with that, we're going to take a moment to connect. Again, this work is deeply relational, so we want to honor that. And before we transition into our first presentation, I would like you to drop in the chat one small win from the start of the new year. This could be professional or personal. We are ending January. We typically start January with goals and kind of renewed energy. And we just wanted to take a moment to think about any wins that have happened over the last month that you would like to share in the chat. A new capacity grant for counselors. Yay, Kim Dalton says that. That is wonderful. We have our largest group yet that have applied to our upcoming March cohort. Wonderful, Heidi. I see our mentors and residents are working well together, and it is joyful to visit them. Personally, my grandson turned 3 this weekend. Oh, Nadine, I love that. Kelly Vaughn, we had a large bumper crop of new teacher candidates enrolled in spring 2026. Wonderful. And also new partnerships with SSFUSD and BUSD. Wonderful. Promotion to Director of Community Engagement and Outreach for my district. I will continue to oversee residency and our aspiring special education program in this new role. Congratulations. Oh, I love all this positive energy. We also received a new counselor grant. Oh my gosh, they're coming in so fast, it's hard to keep track. These are all wonderful though. Oh, Heather Horsley, sticking to strength resistance training schedule, being consistent when it is easy to just keep working. That's wonderful. Good job. Okay, I will let you peruse those. It's always inspiring and uplifting to hear when you hear other people doing great work. And so we'll leave those there for you to check out. And I think we're ready to move on to our first presenter. I'm really excited about this. We have from LPI, Jennifer Bland. She's a senior researcher at the Learning Policy Institute. Her current research spans several issue areas, including teacher preparation and teacher residencies, policies to support students experiencing homelessness, and the intersection between climate change and students, schools, and school systems. At LPI, Bland has co-led a suite of studies on the Texas teacher development system and teacher labor market, 2 of which focus directly on teacher residency implementation and sustainability. Over her career, she has co-authored numerous studies on teacher supply, demand, and distribution, teacher induction, development, evaluation, and compensation, school reform, and improving higher education access and outcomes for students from historically marginalized groups. We are super excited to have her here, and she's going to share a little bit about what's happening in Texas. And Jennifer, I will hand it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Heather. And thank you for that introduction. I'm really pleased to be here with everyone today. As my bio suggests, my particular background as it relates to today's discussion centers on teacher residency implementation in Texas. There's been a lot of work in the state on both the policy and the practice side on strategic staffing as a strategy for residency sustainability. And my colleagues and I really think there are a lot of insights from LPI's research on strategic staffing in Texas that can be applied to this setting. If you want to jump to the next slide, there is a very quick agenda. You can see there's a lot to discuss, so let's jump right in with the Texas context. In Texas, the first major statewide investment in teacher residencies was in 2021. This was through a competitive grant program called T-Class, and it provided around $78 million for resident and mentor teacher stipends and nearly $13 million for technical assistance on strategic staffing to help LEAs build towards sustainably funding these stipends after the grant ended in 2024. To qualify for T-Class funding, LEAs had to meet state-defined requirements that focused on fostering program quality and sustainability. These included shared LEA EPP program governance and data sharing, year-long clinical placements for a minimum of 3 days per week, participation by LEA and EPP leaders in strategic staffing technical assistance, and implementation of strategic staffing by the end of the grant. More recently in Texas, HB2, an omnibus education finance package recently passed by the legislature, includes ongoing dollars for LEAs to partially fund resident and mentor teacher stipends. Because there's an LEA matching requirement to this, LEAs need to contribute at least $10K to a minimum $20K per stipend per resident per year. We think strategic staffing is going to continue to play a really big role in helping LEAs pay for resident stipends. I know that many of you already have some familiarity with strategic staffing, but just to quickly level set, strategic staffing in the residency context is a strategy for achieving at least partial financial sustainability of the paid residency model by reallocating instructional support staff dollars while still meeting those instructional support needs. Specifically, strategic staffing models reallocate LEA funds, for example, for roles like substitute teachers or paraeducators to residency stipends. And in return, residents fulfill these instructional roles on a part-time basis. In practice, when implemented carefully, and I'll talk about what that looks like, adopting a strategic staffing model allows LEAs to provide residents both financial compensation for their service and a robust year-long residency experience. Next slide has a quote here from a T-Class technical assistance provider who said, "You can think differently about how to leverage residents. Districts don't have extra money, so how are you going to use the money you already have? Well, if I were a building principal, I would much rather say I'm going to have these residents be my primary subs, and we're going to do it in a strategic way so it's not taking away from their teacher prep. Or I can use these strategic staffing models to think differently about who I go to first for before and after school tutoring. And I've already got that money. I don't have to find that money." So as you may know, strategic staffing can take a number of different forms. The four most common iterations that we saw in Texas were resident as part-time sub, part-time paraeducator, part-time tutor or enrichment teacher, or as a co-teacher, often in multi-classroom setups. And I'll dive into each of these roles next, but I first want to emphasize the part-time nature of each of these strategic staffing responsibilities, such that the resident's focus still remains primarily on their time alongside their mentor teacher in their mentor's classroom. In fact, as part of California's TRGP requirements, there's an explicit stipulation that LEAs which adopt strategic staffing must reserve 50% or more of each resident's time to be working alongside their mentor teacher. The most common implementation of strategic staffing that we saw in our Texas research situated the resident as a part-time sub, and we know there are a good number of California programs doing this as well. This can take several forms. One is what I'm calling ad hoc, where the resident fills in for a different teacher each week as needed, typically one to no more than 2 set days per week. For example, some LEAs we studied explain that they have residents slotted into sub every Friday because they know that Friday is the most common day for teachers to be out. Another form this can take is splitting a long-term sub position across several residents. And yet another is providing the mentor teacher who that resident works with, or providing another teacher with regular release time. That overlaps with the resident as co-teacher approach, which I'll elaborate on a little bit later. To quote from a set of case studies on Texas residencies that LPI just recently released, having residents serve as substitute or guest teachers is an attractive proposition for districts. Residents are already familiar with their district and school's expectations and instructional approach, and they've likely already established strong relationships with other teachers and residents at their placement site. As one principal described, residents were used to the instructional materials we're using, so they knew how to navigate through those. Our teachers didn't have to leave as detailed lesson plans as they typically would for a sub. When we had our residents come in, teachers were excited because the instruction would continue. They continued with the reading or math lesson exactly the way a teacher of record would. Another option is having the resident serve as a part-time paraeducator, either 1 to no more than 2 set days per week or on multiple partial days per week. Often this involves splitting the role of one full-time para across multiple residents. A few interesting notes on this model as we saw it implemented in Texas. This is often the strategic staffing mechanism of choice in grow your own programs where folks with previous para experience are training to become teachers of record. There's also some promising momentum in some of these partnerships where residents with previous para experience are cohorted with residents who are new to the para role for strategic staffing, which allows the experienced paras to share expertise. And another promising practice we saw involves assigning site coordinators by strategic staffing role, which allows them to target their feedback and practicum instruction, since site coordinators often also teach resident practicum courses. So this shows just one example of how this might be laid out. In this example, for certain days of the week, resident A would spend the morning in their mentor teacher's classroom and the afternoon in a para role floating between the other classrooms at that grade level. Meanwhile, resident B would do the opposite. They'd spend the morning in the floating para role and the afternoon in their mentor teacher's classroom. Yet another strategic staffing approach situates the resident as a part-time tutor or supplemental enrichment instructor to 1 or more students. This is typically several partial days per week and has the advantage of being able to happen before or after school as well as during the school day, which helps maximize the time the resident can spend alongside their mentor teacher. Finally, some of the LEAs we studied in Texas leverage their residents' regular presence in their mentor teacher's classroom as part of their strategic staffing approach. By regularly subbing on a part-time basis for their mentor teacher, the mentor can be freed up to spend some of their time on broader instructional or leadership roles, which can be really helpful to an LEA from a teacher career ladder perspective. I was actually just talking last hour to someone from a Texas LEA who's using this strategic staffing model to have their mentor teachers serve as part-time instructional coaches, which is an approach that they're really excited about. This approach also includes multi-classroom instructional setups, where a resident mentor teacher is serving as a multi-classroom leader. For example, in the opportunity culture model, which some LEAs we studied in Texas have implemented. Quick terminology note here, if you look up opportunity culture, I should flag that they also use the term strategic staffing, but they use it in a slightly different way than it's generally used when talking about residency, so just keep that in mind. As I've alluded to throughout, and as I'm sure many of you are already familiar with, there is a need for guardrails around strategic staffing responsibilities to ensure the primary focus remains on resident development to serve as a teacher of record. The main challenge relates to ensuring that the resident's time and energy is sufficiently protected to ensure that strategic staffing enhances and does not detract from the resident's comprehensive clinical prep. As the Texas Education Agency described in T-Class application and governance materials, this really requires intentional planning and support from both LEAs and EPPs. We saw 3 especially important structures in Texas LEAs that help provide these guardrails. The first is time limitations, which I referenced earlier, to ensure that the majority of a resident's time is spent learning alongside their mentor teacher. This includes serving in the strategic staffing role only on designated days per week, only for a certain amount of time. The second is that in numerous LEAs, residents don't fulfill strategic staffing roles until after they've gotten their feet wet in the residency placement, commonly after the first 6 to 8 weeks. And the third is explicit training, either by the site coordinator or by the LEA, on skills and competencies required for the strategic staffing role, and on helping the resident see how that role can contribute to broader learnings about how to become an effective teacher. When strategic staffing is implemented thoughtfully and with the appropriate guardrails, these experiences really can offer a number of meaningful developmental benefits to teacher candidates. For example, when the resident is subbing, they gain additional practice on how to lead a classroom independently. They can develop a deeper understanding of how coursework is scaffolded and sequenced. This can be especially powerful when LEAs deliberately orchestrate sub-placement for grades and subjects directly below and above the resident's placement classroom, as one Texas LEA we studied was especially conscientious about. When a resident is serving as a paraeducator, they can gain a deeper understanding of effective instruction and needed supports for students with special needs. And they can get the opportunity to build closer working relationships with individual students and to better understand individual learning styles. When a resident is tutoring or providing academic enrichment, they can gain insight into differentiated instruction and strategies for remediation and learning acceleration. They also get the opportunity to build closer individual student relationships. And really across strategic staffing roles, residents gain experience with how teachers of record work alongside and productively interact with instructional support staff in a variety of role types. I also want to touch on how technical assistance for strategic staffing has worked in Texas. I know many of you here today are already engaged with SRTAC and the Residency Lab on TA. I just want to underscore how important that participation is. In Texas, you may recall that as part of the T-Class grant I talked about, grantees were required to participate in strategic staffing TA. This was provided by US Prep, who's a national organization that's done a lot of work supporting residencies through university school partnerships. And the TA in Texas took two forms. First, US Prep provided some TA directly to T-Class LEAs. Second, to build towards sustainability, the state had US Prep work with regional education service centers. These are the Texas analog to California's county offices of education, in a train-the-trainer context, with the service centers now equipped to deliver this TA directly to new LEAs. The fact that US Prep was supporting some LEAs and their partner EPPs directly with strategic staffing implementation really helped them understand the on-the-ground issues programs were grappling with and incorporate those learnings into the training they provided to the service center staff. Additionally, the T-Class strategic staffing TA was very, very deliberate about helping partnerships fit strategic staffing in with the broader elements of a quality residency and helping partnerships institute the type of guardrails I talked about earlier. There are a number of insights from our Texas research on residencies and strategic staffing that my colleagues and I think are really relevant and actionable for this California audience. First, staggering residency implementation by waiting at least 1 or 2 years to incorporate strategic staffing in new to residency LEAs has helped focus initial attention on building structures and practices for high quality clinical training and on fostering buy-in. Specifically, we found in our Texas research that LEA buy-in to the residency approach really accelerates once residency alumni have graduated into teacher of record positions, and LEA staff are able to see how they're performing relative to teachers trained through other pathways. We thought that Texas did a real service to T-Class districts by waiting to introduce strategic staffing TA until after the first year of the partnership was complete. Second, direct engagement by key LEA leaders, including business office staff in shared program governance, has equipped LEAs to thoughtfully assess needs and select strategic staffing models. LEAs that involved finance personnel into shared program governance were positioned especially well because these staff already understood the ins and outs of the residency structure more broadly. And this allowed them to more easily assess how strategic staffing would logistically work, how it would operationally work, and how it would work while maintaining the appropriate guardrails. Third, as we discussed a few slides ago, providing role-specific training on key skills and competencies has helped prepare residents to take on their strategic staffing roles in a way that contributes to their broader development as teacher candidates. Cohorting residents in their EPP practicum coursework by the strategic staffing model their LEA is using has really helped facilitate that training. Fourth, as also discussed in detail earlier, ensuring appropriate guardrails around strategic staffing responsibilities has helped protect resident time and focus. And this includes setting limitations on the time that a resident can spend in their strategic staffing role, waiting to introduce their role until at least a few weeks into the resident's time in their mentor teacher's classroom. And then finally, I want to emphasize that funds from strategic staffing alone have not always been sufficient to fund resident stipends, but they really have been a key piece of the puzzle in building sustainable residency partnerships. According to Texas Education Agency staff, in the first year after T-Class ended, 80% of grantees were able to fund stipends at or above $20,000, and 56 at or above $20,000, and 80% at or above $10,000. So not everyone, but some were able to maintain the $20,000 stipend through strategic staffing alone. Funding challenges were concentrated in smaller and more rural districts. The upshot here, I think, is that strategic staffing is not by itself a silver bullet, but it can augment whatever funds come in from the state, and it can fulfill district matching requirements like those that have been implemented in Texas's new school finance legislation. If you're interested in learning more, a lot of the material that I discussed today comes from a brief that my colleague Steve Wojciechowicz released this past August, which specifically focuses on developing sustainable teacher residencies in Texas. Steve and I co-led a suite of work on Texas residencies that this brief is drawn from, and the brief itself, as well as the related reports, are linked here. So I will leave it at that. Thanks so much for your time, and I'm looking forward to engaging with your questions.
I have one here from Cindy Fox. As programs that use residents as paraprofessionals or co-teachers for sustainability, how do you navigate this during the student teaching portion of the residency when there are specific credentialing and supervision requirements?
So I actually really like Rebecca Hatkoff's response to this, which is
Yeah.
about residency pacing.
Mhm.
Um, so I admit to not knowing the specific regulations in Texas for the different positions that residents can serve in strategic staffing roles. That's something that we haven't heard come to the surface that there have been particular challenges about. But because I don't know those particulars, I unfortunately can't speak in too much detail to that question without, wading into territory where I'm just being speculative. But it's something that I think having the right people in the room for shared governance, I want to go back to that idea, is such an important piece of the puzzle because you want people who understand what those requirements are and what the mechanisms are that you can put in place so that you don't have to keep playing telephone between the governance team and other folks in the district who hold that expertise.
And then we have a couple different questions here in the chat regarding what this looks like in the rural or small school setting.
Mhm.
Did any of your research speak to that specific context?
Yeah, so I mentioned that sustainability at the original T-class funding level of $20,000 per resident was tricky, particularly in more rural and smaller settings. And that was typically a function of their not, the number of residents that they host and the just sort of economies of scale. There, not being as much money from the beginning to go around. B, there not being as much sometimes opportunity for, if you have 5 residents instead of 20 and you're trying to fulfill enough staffing needs to address, what the district needs to be able to move that money over, that just the economies of scale didn't always work so well in those contexts. But the important piece I think that we learned was that strategic staffing was still a piece of the puzzle. It just wasn't sufficient to get them over that $20,000 hump that was the threshold for T-class and is the new threshold, but with state support under HB2. So there's a question about student outcomes that I want to address. We
Yes,
have
yes,
not
I saw
yet
that. Let's talk
collected
about that.
data. We have not yet collected data specifically, and I say yet, we have not done a project where we've collected data. We're not involved in a project currently where we're collecting data on specific outcome of strategic staffing. But there are colleagues in Texas who've done work, and if you want to contact me offline, I can forward this to you, that looked specifically at resident outcomes, or I'm sorry, at student outcomes in 2 important populations. One was outcomes of students of residency alumni once they become teachers of record relative to outcomes of students of teachers, new teachers trained through other pathways. And one that they looked at was actually how do the kids do in the year where a mentor teacher has a resident in their classroom? In other words, are there concerns about that, taking time away from student learning? And in both cases, the findings that our colleagues at Texas Tech and UNC EPIC found were really positive in terms of resident student learning outcomes. And so you had students learning as much or more in classrooms that were hosting residents, and you had students learning as much to quite a lot more in a given year when they were students of recent residency alumni relative to students of recent alumni of other pathways. So we thought that those were some really promising, data that have come out in the field.
That is great. Amy, I do want to keep my eye on time. How are we doing?
Yeah, I was thinking we could give teams a little bit of time to talk in groups, and maybe,
Okay.
being able to talk with others, have a sounding board, questions could get answered that way. And then I just also want to say too, since we do have spotlight programs that we're going to be featuring later, now that Jennifer's kind of given us an overarching kind of picture of what this could look like, we do have programs that are directly doing this in California that maybe some of the specifics around the how and who they talk to and what this oversight of this looks like within a district, that they could then pose those to some of our spotlight programs. But we do want to just say a huge thank you to Jennifer for sharing those insights from Texas on strategic staffing models. The LPI brief that she referenced, along with all of those additional resources on that last slide, are linked in that one-page resource document that I keep dropping in the chat for you under today's session. So if you'd like to read further, you can. But we do want to give you some time to process what you just heard, maybe make some connections to your own context as you brainstorm with other practitioners. And so in your breakout groups, we're just going to spend maybe 5-6 minutes just talking about what resonated most from the content that Jennifer just shared and why, and maybe what was surprising or inspiring for you as you think about how Texas is approaching sustainability. So I am going to go ahead and open those breakout rooms right now. It'll be a quick, maybe 5-6 minute conversation for trios. So you should see an invite come your way right now.
To everyone. Hope that was a great chance to stretch, grab a drink, and do a little reset so we can get back into our meeting, back into our great content. Next up, you all are going to have the chance to hear directly from the 3 programs we've been mentioning that are using strategic staffing models to increase sustainability for their residency programs. You will be hearing from Lemon Grove School District, Escondido Union School District, San Ramon Valley Unified School District. And so here's how this part will work. In a moment, you will be placed into a breakout room. In each breakout, a presenter will walk you through their staffing model for about 10 minutes. And then you'll have 5 minutes for Q&A and some clarification. You get to stay in the same breakout room the whole time. The presenters will rotate. So you'll get to hear from all 3 programs. So that's how that will work. And it's meant to be a chance to listen, ask questions, and start thinking about what is possible in your own context. And so before we go into those breakouts, I'll give a quick introduction to each of the presenters before we get started. First up is you'll hear from Leanne Gategno, who is the coordinator of special education in Lemon Grove School District, where she's worked for more than 20 years in a range of special education roles. Today, Leanne will share Lemon Grove's paraprofessional residency model and how it supports inclusive practices, strong teacher preparation, and of course, long-term sustainability. Next up, you also hear from Hannah Arp, who is a personnel technician and residency liaison for Escondido Union School District. And she's been closely involved in launching and supporting their program since it started. Hannah will highlight Escondido's paraprofessional residency model and how it helps remove barriers, prepare student-centered educators, and build a sustainable staffing pipeline. And finally, Nadine Rosenwig is the residency coordinator for San Ramon Valley Unified School District's Teachers for Tomorrow program. She brings more than 30 years of experience as a teacher, administrator, and administrator coach. Nadine will share San Ramon Valley's substitute teacher residency model and how it creates a sustainable pathway for developing future educators. That's an overview of each of the presenters. We're very thankful that they're going to share their experiences, and we will go ahead and get started and get our breakout rooms going.
This is the planning tool that I referenced at the beginning of our presentation, where you can document where you are in regards to the characteristic of operational sustainability. You can see here on the document, there is the characteristic. It breaks down the characteristic, and then it kind of moves you through a series of table graphics that help you indicate where you are in terms of your own operational sustainability. So taking a moment to fill this out in collaboration with your SR Tech coach or your TLR coach, or in partnership with your partners, would be really helpful in terms of your own sustainability, just thinking about having these institutional documents that support the work. And so we did want to encourage you to do that before we sign off. And then moving into our feedback moment, I believe. And I'll pass it to Amy.
Yes, we do have a few reminders to still go over, but before we wrap up, we would really appreciate you taking some time to give us feedback on today's session. We do look at that. Javier, Heather, and I meet after every session to peruse the feedback and make adjustments before we go into the planning for the next session. So if you could, this is linked to the one-page resource document that we have dropped in the chat. You can also access it through the QR code that is on the screen. But again, it's a very short form that we would appreciate getting the opportunity to hear from you. It's nice to know what's working well and what additional support or topics you'd like to see us cover in future sessions. Well, thank you for doing that. And then as we wrap up today, just want to give a quick look ahead. Our next Power Up convening is scheduled for March 16th. And as I mentioned at the onset of our meeting today, for anyone that may have joined late, that is a new date. We will no longer be meeting on Friday, February 20th. We have replaced that session date with Monday, March 16th. You should have received an email from Zoom with an updated calendar invite notifying you of this change. But in that session, we're going to be focusing on exploring innovative funding solutions from the field. Other than LCAP and staffing models, we'll be looking at some other things that we're seeing programs do as they look ahead towards long-term sustainability. And we'll be giving you some time to really collaborate as you plan next steps based on everything you've heard this year. And we're really looking forward to kind of building on today's work and continuing these conversations together. Between now and our next session, though, please don't hesitate to reach out for coaching support from your regional hub leads as well as our TRL coaches. Again, all of the support that we provide is complimentary. All you need to do is either scan the QR code or you can fill out the form that is linked to our resource page as well. Our leads are very experienced with staffing models, the different models that we went over today, and they're happy to provide that kind of personalized support and guidance if you're considering exploring implementation, or if you already have an existing staffing approach that you want to work to refine. They are available to help assist you with that. And then we just want to thank you again for your time and engagement today, getting to spend part of your Monday with you as you kick off the new work week. And we look forward to seeing you next time. We hope everyone has a great rest of their week. Thank you, everybody. Take care. Have a great rest of your day.